exposition is essential in any game of Dungeons & Dragons, which is to say the information that you give your players to establish the background of your world and the story and the characters in it. But beyond just explicitly stating what the plot is, or revealing the secret conspiracy point by point, or just blatantly telling your players a wizard did it, how do you give your players exposition, or a story, or just a world that feels real or lived in? One word: environmental storytelling. Yeah, I know. But seriously, exposition dumps are all well and good. But we don't play RPGs just to be presented with the information. We don't play RPGs just to watch a story unfold. We play RPGs to take part in the game, and in the world the game takes place in. So what do I mean when I say environmental storytelling? I'm going to start off by quoting an article by Bart Stewart written in 2015 on the gaming industry website Gamasutra. And then I'm going to tell you why I don't think the quote is entirely complete. So, to quote this article, again, by Bart Stewart, I just want to make sure I have that right. Environmental storytelling shows the final outcome of a sequence of events, then invites players to make up their own stories about what happened to cause that outcome. So, think about a crime scene. The crime happens. Let's say a mobster gets whacked. Blood sprays from the wound and spatters on the wall. The furniture in the room gets knocked around and set out of place. There's signs of a struggle, in other words. Then, when the cops show up, the hitman books it, leaving distinctive mismatched size 13 boot prints through the victim's flower bed. That's environmental storytelling. Even though the cops weren't there when the crime happened, they can pick up on the events, how it went down, even who was involved. In this case, Vinny 2 Left Feet and Doug Forsyth with his prize-winning azaleas. Now, the reason that I say that Mr. Stewart's quote isn't entirely complete is that, in my mind, the quote seems to imply that environmental storytelling is best served by just creating these little vignettes and inviting the players to make up a quick little story about how the outcome that you see presented actually happened. And while that's totally true, it can be used for so many other different things. Environmental storytelling can set tone. It can foreshadow or imply danger. Did a scary thing happen here? Could that scary thing happen again to your party? Environmental storytelling can also provide characterization. It can provide information to your players about major characters that you have set up. For example, environmental storytelling can provide information to the cops about who Doug Forsyth was and the fact that he was very proud of his prize-winning azaleas. You know, trophies set around the room that were knocked over in the tussle. Environmental storytelling can establish lore and facts about your world building that might be snuck in under the radar to make it seem less like you're hitting your players over the head with them. One of my favorite examples of that is in Dark Souls, I'm sure you've heard of it, where the entire pantheon of gods that this story revolves around is never explicitly revealed to the player. You just pick it up through clues here and there in the environment. And so on and so forth. So, how do you do this? How do you, as a dungeon master, make environmental storytelling? What elements do you choose to present to your players, and how do you choose to present them? I'm going to go off the rails a little bit and tell you about Locard's exchange principle. This is one of the foundational theories of forensic investigation. And simply put, it is this. Every time a body interacts with a person, place, or thing, it leaves behind physical evidence. The example that I have in the book that I was reading is cat hair. It's basically like if you own a cat, you have cat hair on you. And therefore, we can establish that you own a cat. There's a story there. That's environmental storytelling. So, for a more practical example, I'm going to go to one of my favorite horror movies of all time, John Carpenter's 1980s movie, The Thing. I'm talking about the movie from the 80s, not the one from the 1950s or the one from the early thousands that was alright, I guess. In The Thing, a couple of... how best to summarize The Thing? In The Thing, a team of scientists and support staff stationed in Antarctica have to contend with the fact that somewhere in their midst lies a shape-shifting alien. And of course they're isolated from the outside world because they're in Antarctica and there's a snowstorm and a whole bunch of people succumb to paranoia and aliens and horrible mutilation and all of that stuff. But before all of that happens, they receive evidence that a neighboring camp, helmed by Norwegians, has succumbed to some horrible trauma. So, Kurt Russell's character, along with a couple of other characters, Wilford Brimley being one of them, weirdly enough, go out to investigate the Norwegian camp. This scene is one of the best examples of environmental storytelling as it can apply to your game that has ever been created. So I'm not going to go too deep into the specifics. You should just track down this movie and watch this scene. It's fantastic, and it is one of the tensest and scariest and goriest things you will ever see. Yet, content warning, it's horrible. It's really rough in so many different ways, too. So, Kurt Russell lands the helicopter at the Norwegians' Antarctic camp. The first thing you notice is that the camp is on fire, or it was on fire until very recently. The fire has gone out for the most part, and all that Kurt Russell and company see is a column of black smoke. So this already implies danger. This already implies that something has happened here, and Kurt Russell and company have just kind of stumbled across the tail end of it. So, dovetailing with Mr. Stewart's claim, this definitely does present players with the final outcome of the situation. But let's take a closer look at this. What do they find as they're going through, and what does this imply for the story that is being presented? So let's set the scene. Kurt Russell and company enter the charred remains of the Norwegian camp. They walk through dark and abandoned corridors where the only light comes from holes punched in the walls, letting in this really upsetting amount of snow and ice. An environment that should have been self-contained has been punctured and opened up through who knows what. This implies the power to tear apart this structure at its very seams, and not just because of the fire that has just recently been put out. Next up, they come across a fire axe buried in a door. And of course, The Thing, which I can't believe they used the same exact title. It's infuriating to me as a fan of The Thing, not The Later Thing, or The Earliest Thing, but The Middle Thing. In The Later Thing, The Thousands Thing, they set out to explain how all of this stuff happened, but as a viewer of The Thing from the 1980s, The Thing, you're just left to see it and absorb it and kind of process it as an audience member. So Kurt Russell and company find this fire axe embedded in a door. It's a great scene. I think they open up the door and they see the axe embedded in it, and it's revealed to you as an audience member that that is a thing that's happened. So that implies violence. That implies somebody had the motive to bury an axe into a door. They had some reason to do that. Something that is not something that you come across in your day-to-day life. Next, they find the frozen body of someone who had killed themselves. And like I said, content warning, it's in a very grisly way. But likewise, the fact that they had taken the steps to kill themselves and no one had taken the time to recover the body or prepare it for any sort of respectful funeral means that this happened at the end of this chain of events and no one was around to take care of it. Likewise, this person had some reason to end their lives prematurely. And after that, we come across some reason why they might have chosen to do so. When Kurt Russell and company delve further into the Norwegian camp, they find the charred remains of a weirdly mutated body. It's got two mouths that seemed to have melded into one. Two sets of features that have, like silly putty, mooshed together into some horrendous being that was killed and set on fire to get rid of the remains in a safe way. And then finally, what Kurt Russell comes across is a giant chunk of ice deep within the Norwegian camp that used to have something in it. So, step by step, let's walk through what all of this stuff has done. First off, it has shown you, the audience, that there has been violence. This shows you kind of the caliber and the scale of the violence that has happened. For example, the axe in the door means that there was an assailant and somebody trying to ostensibly attack that assailant, or vice versa, I guess, a victim and an assailant anyway. Likewise, there's been a fire set. There have been holes punched in the structure of this building that means the thing that has done the punching is big and powerful and really scary. This also suggests the tools and the techniques that have been used to fight this monster. So fire is one of them. The remains that they come across were burnt. Possibly that's some way that the Norwegians have learned to deal with this threat. Likewise, the fire axe and a couple of other instances of environmental storytelling imply the different weapons, tools, and techniques that were used to deal with this threat. Good information for any party of adventurers to have. And finally, this builds lore. If John Carpenter were the dungeon master and Kurt Russell and company were the party, then this would be a great moment to establish the lore and the world that has been built. Something came out of that big block of ice. Something that the Norwegian team pulled out of the permafrost. And now it's gone. So, though I completely agree with Mr. Stewart's definition of environmental storytelling, I want to provide my own, hopefully more inclusive definition of environmental storytelling as a technique. Ready? Here goes. Environmental storytelling is the stuff that the actors in the story leave behind when the story happens. This stuff that the actors leave behind lets you as the players or the readers or any type of audience really synthesize several different types of information. Not just the outcome of the scenario, but the implications of the scenario and the scenario's broader context. In other words, what the scenario as it plays out means for you and your party. So, okay, let's go back to Locard's exchange principle. As a refresher, this was basically just saying that any acting body will leave evidence of itself, and anything that it tries to act upon will leave evidence of its, stuff on the actor. So let's think about this as dungeon masters. How can we put together a story using things like Locard's exchange principle in your environment? First things first, you have to decide what's going on. What, in other words, is the overarching situation? And you can put this into a really quick summary, just 1 or 2 sentences. For example, a shape-shifting alien infiltrated a research camp and, one by one, slaughtered the inhabitants. And then at this point, start to ask yourself questions about the situation. Who was there? How many people? Who were they? Vinny Two-Tone, what did I call him? Vinny Two Left Feet. Vinny Two Left Feet would have left behind some evidence of Vinny's size 13, 2 left feet. In other words, who were the actors in this situation? On both sides. Like, for example, were some people trying to attack other people? Were some people trying to hide something from the police or law enforcement agencies? And so on and so forth. Who, in other words, was trying to do what? And, as a bonus question, did they succeed? And there are a bunch of different questions that you can start asking yourself about the situation. There isn't any hard and fast list of them, but those are a good place to start. Who was there? What were they trying to do? Did they succeed? Then start to ask yourself, what would that look like? What evidence would they leave behind? And broad categories are okay. Like, for example, let's just take a cyberpunk setting. The rebellion against the overlord drinks a particular type of discontinued energy beverage. And, they like pop it and like pound it and then crush the can and leave it behind. If you find these cans at the scene of a crime, then that implies that the rebels were in some way involved. Or the rebels are being framed. For a better thought out example, in Star Wars, when the stormtroopers are trying to frame the Tusken Raiders for the death of Luke's family, Obi-Wan Kenobi says, "These aren't Tusken Raiders. Tusken Raiders always travel in single file to hide their numbers." Are there particular markers, in other words, that the actors that you've established would leave behind? And then for another example of the actors acting upon a scene, we can go to Sherlock Holmes as a great example of environmental storytelling in this fashion. In A Study in Scarlet, there's a word written on the wall in blood. Rache. Rache. There's a German word written on the wall in blood. That's environmental storytelling so thoroughly used that is the basis for the entire rest of the story. Sherlock Holmes has to figure out who killed this person. Why would they write that word that I'm not going to try to pronounce? It's R-A-C-H-E, Rache, on the wall. We have actors leaving behind evidence and goals being achieved. So let's come up with a dungeon master example. Your players set out to rescue a youth from a Lich's tower. How could we, as Dungeon Masters, use this environment to tell a story? So I have a list here, actually, of just things that we could do with environmental storytelling. First off, we could foreshadow what lays ahead in the Lich's chamber. Maybe the Lich has a pack of ghouls that he uses as henchmen, mindless servants to carry out his nefarious bidding. There would be a kennel, maybe, emptied of its inhabitants, but you can see that there are half-chewed bits of human remains in the food bowls. Or you could foreshadow the Lich's powers. Say, for example, that the players come across the body of someone who was recently alive. They know, they spoke to them just this morning, but the body looks as though it had died years and years ago. All of these things serve to imply that there is a danger somewhere in the future that the players will come across that they know to prepare for and they know to dread. Likewise, we can provide the players hints as to how to defeat the Lich with environmental storytelling. So, for example, the players come across a ritual room in which the Lich had been preparing a phylactery, a vessel in which the Lich was going, in which the Lich would switch their pitch to ditch their life force. So with that environmental storytelling and a sufficiently canny player, they'd be able to establish the fact that killing the Lich's body might not be the way to defeat the Lich entirely. Likewise, the Lich might leave behind some evidence in the environment as to why they're doing this, some motivation or characterization. Maybe the Lich has a portrait of their long-dead lover that the abducted youth really resembles. That's kind of cliche, but you understand what I'm getting at. The environment and environmental storytelling can provide a lot of information that might have otherwise just been left for, like, the Lich standing in the boss arena being like, "You won't understand the lost love that I feel in my heart." Environmental storytelling gives us an opportunity to provide information that might otherwise be relegated to an exposition dump. We can even go so far as to imply more plot hooks in the Lich's tower using environmental storytelling. For example, the Lich was able to pursue this goal that the Lich wanted to do, but the Lich was only able to do so because he was tipped off by some other third nefarious party that the players are only learning about now. Like, say, an ancient evil god was able to give a message to the Lich, telling the Lich that by doing this thing that the god wanted them to do, they would be able to reclaim their lost lover, or something like that. Yeah, I'm kind of just spitballing here, but you see what I'm getting at. There are ample opportunities in environmental storytelling to impart information to the players that you wouldn't be able to otherwise, that can be such a great, meaty, juicy way for your players to get hooked. I rambled really hard there. What was I saying? Oh, I don't even know. Basically, environmental storytelling doesn't just let your players create the scenario in their head and establish why the outcome was what it was. Environmental storytelling is a tool that you, as a dungeon master or an artist of any kind, can use to establish so many different things. Again, just to reiterate, characterization, foreshadowing, spooky stuff, tone. You can use environmental storytelling to make something really poignant or beautiful or sad or scary. There's just so much you can do with environmental storytelling that doesn't have to just be, here's a little vignette. Now you, player, come up with the scenario in your head. So here's the summary of the technique. Anything that you want to tell your players without saying it in so many words, think about what evidence that would leave behind. If you want to tell your players that the Lich had a long-lost lover, then put a portrait of the long-lost lover in, like, an honored place above the Lich's mantelpiece. Or maybe you find a locket that the Lich had that has a picture of the lover, or a letter from the lover detailing, you know, their love affair when the Lich was still alive. Stuff like that. Or say you want to give hints on how to defeat the Lich or any other given big bad. Think about what steps the big bad would take to prevent that stuff from happening and what evidence that would leave behind. Or maybe somebody else tried that or came up with an idea to defeat them, but never got a chance to see it through. Like, for example, they come across the body of another adventurer that had, like, a special potion in their backpack, or the ingredients to make a potion that they never got around to making because the Lich or whatever big bad killed them, or, they fell down a hole or something. If you want to build out your story's lore or build plot hooks into the environment, then this is a great chance to do it too. You can use, I don't know, what evidence would that leave behind? Like, if we're going with the Lich is trying to do this thing at the behest of an ancient evil god, maybe the ancient evil god can only be contacted through this particular ritual that your players have seen before and didn't understand the meaning of. Or something like that. Some element in the environment, some physical evidence that ties this part of the setting into the wider story that you've already established, or intend to establish later on down the line. So, to this point, I've given you a definition of what environmental storytelling is, and I provided different examples of environmental storytelling in movies and books, and even gone over how you can implement it in your own games. But as a conclusion, I kind of want to talk about why. Why do we do this? Why do we care? And it took me a while to put this into words, but I do have a very concrete reason as to why environmental storytelling is important. And it is because of this, and I'm just going to read it off of here because I try to spitball this stuff and it never works out, so bear with me. I have like a really good, oh, here it is. This is my filing system. I literally just threw that piece of paper on the floor. With environmental storytelling, you're not just being presented with the information. You're observing it, and you're finding it, and you're putting it together on your own. And all of a sudden, the information that would have just been an exposition dump that people had to sit through becomes a game in and of itself. You win when you figured out what happened. In my time as a dungeon master, I have found out that things are much more impactful if you bring your players 90% of the way there, and then rely on them to make that last 10% of the way on their own. I have told things to my players and explained to my players what's happening, and oftentimes the response that I get is just kind of like a nod and like a, okay, cool, let's fight goblins. But when I present elements of my story in the environment, when I use environmental storytelling to imply things happened, or imply some aspect of a character, or imply some broader element of the world that I've come up with, I get players going, oh, and then they remember it, and then they bring it to the table on their own. And honestly, as a dungeon master, that's one of the most satisfying things to have happen ever. So that's it. That's my lesson on environmental storytelling. I hope you got something out of it because this is one of the techniques that I rely on most as a dungeon master to tell my players about the world that they are living in. My name is Dungeon Master Lee, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Dungeon Master You, where you are the Dungeon Master. I will never get sick of that tagline. It tickles me every time I say it. And I hope you enjoy it too. Likewise, I hope you tell me about your games down in the comments below or on Twitter. I love hearing about how people have taken the techniques that I've talked about and made them their own. There's so much you can do with these techniques and other techniques that I have just barely scratched the surface on, and I love learning about new things. So don't be afraid to reach out. I have such a hard time signing off on these. So until then, this is Dungeon Master Lee saying, stay adventurous. My nose itches. I'm gonna pick the boogers, and then I'm gonna start again. Don't tell my audience. They still think I'm cool.